You don't belong in this room, Richard Whitmore said without even looking up, his voice slicing through the polished silence of the glass-walled boardroom like a blade sharpened by years of arrogance, and every executive seated around the 30-foot walnut table fell quiet as Naomi Carter froze beside her janitor cart, one hand still gripping the spray bottle, the other clutching the cloth she had been using to wipe fingerprints from the conference glass. The city skyline stretched behind them in gold and silver through floor-to-ceiling windows on the 42nd floor, sunlight bouncing off steel towers and flooding the room with warm afternoon light. But none of that warmth reached Naomi's face as Richard slowly rose from his leather chair, adjusted the cuffs of his tailored navy suit, and stared at her with the same cold irritation someone might reserve for a stain on expensive carpet. How many times do I have to tell facilities not to send cleaning staff in here while I'm meeting with investors? He snapped, loud enough that even the men near the far end of the table shifted awkwardly in their seats. Naomi lowered her eyes and quietly reached for her cart. I'm sorry, sir. I was told this room was empty. Richard let out a dry laugh, humorless and cruel. Clearly whoever hired you overestimated your intelligence. A few of the men around the table chuckled under their breath, not because it was funny, but because when powerful men laugh, weaker men tend to follow. Naomi swallowed hard and turned to leave, but then Richard leaned toward the 3 foreign investors seated beside him and muttered something under his breath in flawless French, his lips curling into a smug half-smile as he assumed the woman in the faded blue uniform could never possibly understand him. These people should stick to mops and buckets. Give them a paycheck and suddenly they think they're human. More laughter. Softer this time. Sharper. Naomi stopped walking. Her hand tightened around the metal handle of the cart until her knuckles turned pale. Her breathing slowed. Because Richard Whitmore had made one fatal mistake. He assumed she was too beneath him to understand every word he had just said. Naomi turned her head slightly, just enough for her eyes to flick toward him, but she said nothing. Not yet. The meeting resumed as if she had already disappeared, because that was what people like Richard did best. They erased people they didn't value. Richard straightened his tie and slid a thick leather folder across the table toward the investors, his confidence filling the room again as he smiled that polished billionaire smile that belonged on magazine covers and business journals. Gentlemen, he said smoothly, if we're all in agreement, let's finalize this acquisition. The Frenchman nodded and one of them turned the contract toward Richard, tapping a manicured finger near the signature line. Naomi's eyes drifted to the page as she pushed her cart toward the door, and then her breath caught. Just for a second. Because printed near the bottom of page 14 was a clause she recognized instantly, one buried beneath layers of legal language and international terminology, but one her eyes caught with terrifying clarity. Her entire body stiffened. No. Her heart pounded. That clause transferred full liability in the merger. Richard's company would absorb every legal and financial consequence if the partnership collapsed. It was a trap. A deliberate one. Naomi looked from the paper to the smiling investors. Then to Richard, already uncapping his pen. The room blurred around her. Her pulse thundered in her ears. She could walk away. She could let him sign. Let the arrogant man who mocked her destroy himself with his own pride. She could leave and say nothing. But Naomi Carter had never been built that way. Before fear could stop her, before logic could silence her, before survival could remind her what happened when people like her spoke out of turn, Naomi stepped forward and her voice cut clean through the room. Sir, she said firmly, her tone calm but sharp enough to freeze every head in place. If you sign that contract, you'll lose everything. The room went so quiet Naomi could hear the faint hum of the air conditioner above the marble ceiling panels. Richard Whitmore stared at her as if he had not processed what she had just said, his uncapped pen frozen inches above the signature line, while every executive around the table slowly turned toward the woman in the cleaning uniform standing near the door. For one long second no one moved. Then Richard let out a laugh, sharp and disbelieving, and set the pen down with exaggerated patience. Excuse me? He asked, his voice low and dangerous. Naomi kept her posture straight even though her pulse hammered against her ribs. That contract has a liability transfer clause hidden in the French legal wording, she said carefully. If you sign it, your company takes responsibility for every financial loss if the merger fails. A few executives exchanged confused glances. One of the investors stiffened in his chair. Richard's eyes narrowed. And how exactly would you know that? The mockery in his voice rolled through the room like thunder before a storm. Naomi hesitated only briefly. Because I can read French. That answer triggered laughter so sudden and loud it echoed off the glass walls. One junior executive nearly choked trying to suppress his grin. Richard shook his head slowly, smiling the way people smiled when they thought someone had embarrassed themselves beyond repair. You expect me to believe my janitor suddenly reads international legal contracts now? Naomi did not react to the insult. She simply stepped closer to the table, eyes fixed on the open page. Second paragraph from the bottom, she said. The wording says all litigation, damages, and future liabilities transfer solely to Whitmore Global upon execution. One of the French investors shifted again, visibly uncomfortable now. Richard noticed it. His smile faded slightly. He grabbed the contract, his jaw tightening as he scanned the page. That is not what it says, he snapped, but the confidence in his voice had weakened. Naomi inhaled slowly. You are reading the English translation. Look at the original French beneath it. A strange tension settled over the room. Richard looked down again, this time slower. His lips parted slightly. Then he turned toward the investor beside him. Translate this. Right now. The older man swallowed hard and adjusted his glasses before reading the clause aloud in hesitant English. As the words left his mouth, the color drained from Richard's face. Naomi had been exactly right. One executive whispered, "Oh my God!" Another muttered under his breath. Richard stared at the contract like it had personally betrayed him. The room that had laughed seconds earlier now sat frozen in horrified silence. Richard slowly lifted his eyes toward Naomi, and for the first time since she had entered that room, there was no arrogance in them. Only disbelief. How do you know French legal terminology? He asked quietly. Naomi looked down for a moment, then met his stare with calm, steady eyes. Because before my mother got sick, she said, her voice soft but clear, I worked in Paris for 6 years negotiating international compliance agreements for one of the largest finance firms in Europe. No one breathed. Richard blinked. One executive actually leaned back in his chair as if physically hit by the revelation. Naomi continued, her voice even. When my mother was diagnosed with cancer, I came home to take care of her. When the bills piled up, I took the first job I could find. The silence deepened until it felt heavy enough to crush the air from the room. Richard stared at her faded uniform, the mop cart beside her, the cleaning gloves hanging from her pocket, and suddenly all the things he thought he understood no longer made sense. Naomi gave him one final look, calm and unreadable. A uniform tells you what someone does, she said quietly. Not who they are. Richard opened his mouth, but no words came out. And for the first time in years, the most powerful man in the building had absolutely nothing to say. No one laughed after that. The silence in the boardroom stretched so long it almost felt unreal, as if the entire floor of Whitmore Global had forgotten how to breathe. Richard Whitmore stood motionless at the head of the table, staring at Naomi Carter with a look that no one in that room had ever seen on his face before. Confusion. Humility. Shock. The same executives who had mocked her minutes earlier now avoided her eyes entirely, suddenly fascinated by their laptops, their notes, their glasses of water, anything. Except the woman they had mistaken for invisible. Richard slowly placed the contract down onto the polished walnut table, his fingers stiff, deliberate, like even the motion required thought now. Then he cleared his throat. Everyone out, he said quietly. No one moved at first, unsure if they had heard him correctly. Richard lifted his gaze firmer this time. Now. Chairs scraped back instantly. The room emptied in seconds, expensive shoes clicking quickly across marble floors as executives and investors filed out in awkward silence, each one throwing secret glances toward Naomi as they passed. Within moments, the massive boardroom stood empty except for the two of them, the city skyline glowing amber beyond the glass windows as late afternoon sunlight stretched long shadows across the floor. Naomi remained standing beside her cart, calm and unreadable, while Richard walked slowly around the table toward her. Gone was the swagger in his step. Gone was the polished arrogance. He stopped several feet away, studying her like he was trying to understand something impossible. "Why are you cleaning floors?" he finally asked, his voice almost softer than she had ever imagined it could be. Naomi let out a small breath through her nose, not quite a laugh, not quite sadness. "Because life does not always ask what degree you have before it humbles you." Richard stared at her, speechless. Naomi looked toward the skyline for a moment, the fading sunlight reflecting in her eyes. "When my mother got sick, I left everything behind to care for her," she said quietly. "I burned through my savings paying hospital bills, medication, treatments insurance would not cover. By the time she passed, I had nothing left but debt and a resume full of years employers considered too old to matter." Richard said nothing. Naomi continued, her tone calm, matter-of-fact, like she had accepted those truths long ago. "When I tried to return to finance, no one wanted to hire a woman in her late 30s with a gap in her career and no recent references. They did not see my experience. They saw someone they could overlook." Richard lowered his eyes, shame slowly creeping across his face. "So I cleaned offices instead," Naomi finished simply. "Because grief does not pause the rent." The words landed heavily between them. Richard swallowed hard and rubbed the back of his neck, clearly struggling with something unfamiliar to him, guilt. "I was wrong about you," he admitted at last, his voice low. Naomi met his eyes. "No," she said gently. "You were wrong about more than me." Richard frowned slightly. Naomi stepped closer, not aggressively, but with quiet certainty. "You were wrong to think a title makes someone valuable. Wrong to think intelligence wears a suit. Wrong to think dignity comes with salary." Richard's face tightened, each word hitting harder than the last because he knew she was right. He looked around the now empty boardroom, at the leather chairs, the crystal water glasses, the expensive art on the walls, and for the first time all of it felt strangely hollow. Naomi turned back toward her cart and adjusted the handle, ready to leave, but Richard stepped forward instinctively. "Wait." She paused. His voice dropped lower. "You saved my company today." Naomi looked over her shoulder. Richard hesitated, then said the words slowly, as if each one cost him something. "And I do not know how to apologize for the way I treated you." Naomi studied him for a moment, then offered a small, tired smile. "Start by never treating anyone else that way again." Richard stood frozen as she pushed her cart toward the door, her footsteps soft against the marble. But just before she reached the exit, he spoke again, his voice sharper this time, urgent. "Naomi." She stopped but did not turn. Richard straightened his shoulders, eyes focused now, mind racing with an idea that had clearly just struck him. "Come to my office tomorrow morning at 8 sharp," he said. Naomi slowly looked back, brows narrowing slightly. Richard met her gaze with an intensity she had not seen before. "Because I think you are done pushing that cart." Naomi barely slept that night. She lay awake in her small apartment staring at the cracked ceiling above her bed, replaying Richard Whitmore's words over and over in her mind, while rain tapped softly against the window beside her fire escape. "Because I think you are done pushing that cart." She should have felt hopeful. Excited even. But after life had knocked her down enough times, Naomi had learned something painful about hope. It could make disappointment hurt twice as much. By 7:30 the next morning she stood outside Whitmore Global wearing the only blazer she still owned, a charcoal jacket pressed neatly despite its age, the fabric slightly faded at the elbows from years in the back of her closet. She adjusted the strap of her purse and stared up at the towering glass building disappearing into the clouds, sunlight gleaming across its mirrored surface. 20 years ago she would have walked into buildings like this with confidence, briefcase in hand, ready to negotiate contracts with men twice her age. Today her stomach twisted so tightly she thought she might be sick. The lobby doors slid open, and immediately heads turned. The same security guards who normally barely glanced at the cleaning staff blinked in surprise as Naomi crossed the marble floor in heels instead of work shoes, her posture straight, her expression calm, though her heartbeat pounded so hard she could feel it in her throat. The elevator ride to the executive floor felt longer than usual, every second dragging as the mirrored walls reflected a woman she barely recognized, someone trying to remember who she used to be. When the doors opened, Richard's assistant was already waiting. "Miss Carter?" she asked politely. Naomi nodded. "He is expecting you." Naomi followed her through sleek hallways lined with framed awards, financial magazine covers, and photographs of Richard shaking hands with senators and billionaires. The assistant stopped before double oak doors and gently pushed them open. Richard Whitmore stood behind a massive black desk overlooking the city, sleeves rolled neatly to his forearms, tie loosened slightly, a tablet glowing beside him. He looked up as Naomi entered, and for a brief moment the old awkwardness from yesterday flashed between them. "You came," he said simply. Naomi crossed her arms lightly. "You asked me to." Richard nodded, then gestured toward the chair across from him. "Sit, please." Naomi sat carefully, unsure what game this was. Richard folded his hands on the desk and studied her for a moment before speaking. "I reviewed your resume last night." Naomi's brow furrowed. "My resume?" Richard gave a small nod. "Human Resources had your application from years ago when you first applied for janitorial work. I had them dig deeper after you left." Naomi's stomach tightened. Richard leaned back slowly. "Paris Business Institute. Graduated top of your class. Fluent in 4 languages. Former senior compliance strategist at Laurent and Marchand International." Naomi blinked, surprised he had gone that far. Richard shook his head in disbelief. "Do you understand how insane it is that someone with your qualifications has been emptying trash cans in my building for 3 years? Naomi gave a quiet, humorless smile. "Trust me. I asked myself that every day." Richard exhaled deeply, then slid a folder across the desk toward her. Naomi looked down. Inside was an employment contract. Her eyes scanned the title. Senior Director of International Operations. Naomi froze. Her throat tightened instantly. "Richard," he raised a hand gently. "I know this does not erase yesterday. I know one job offer does not undo the disrespect I showed you. But if you are willing to accept it, I want you working beside me, not beneath me." Naomi stared at the paper in stunned silence, her fingers trembling slightly against the folder. The salary listed on the final page was more money than she had seen in nearly a decade. Her vision blurred for half a second. Richard leaned forward. "You earned this before I even knew your name." Naomi swallowed hard, emotion catching in her chest. But before she could answer, the office door suddenly swung open and a sharp female voice cut through the room. "Richard, are you seriously replacing Martin with the janitor?" Both turned instantly. Standing in the doorway was Victoria Langley, Whitmore Global's senior vice president, dressed in white silk and diamonds, her expression twisted in disbelief as her eyes locked onto Naomi. "Tell me this is a joke," she said coldly. Richard's face darkened immediately. But Naomi felt it before he even spoke. The battle was not over. It was only beginning. Victoria Langley stepped fully into the office and shut the door behind her with a soft but deliberate click, her heels striking the polished floor like warning shots as she stared at Naomi with the kind of disbelief people reserved for things they thought did not belong in their world. "Richard, please tell me you have not lost your mind," she said, folding her arms across her tailored white blazer, her voice dripping with polished contempt. Richard rose from his chair slowly, his expression tightening. "Victoria, this does not concern you. It concerns me when the future of this company is being handed to someone who was scrubbing baseboards yesterday morning," Victoria snapped. Naomi remained seated, shoulders straight, refusing to shrink beneath the weight of the woman's stare even though every word landed exactly where Victoria intended. Richard's jaw flexed. Miss Carter saved this company from signing a fraudulent contract yesterday. Victoria let out a short laugh and turned toward Naomi, looking her up and down with open skepticism. And I am sure that makes for a lovely little story, but saving one meeting does not qualify someone to sit in an executive office. Naomi inhaled quietly but said nothing. She had spent enough years surviving rooms like this to know when silence carried more dignity than reaction. Victoria stepped closer to the desk and jabbed a finger toward the contract in Naomi's hands. Do you know what happens if word gets out that Whitmore Global handed a senior executive position to a cleaning woman overnight? The board will panic. Investors will question your judgment. Our competitors will laugh us into the ground. Richard's voice dropped lower. Watch yourself. But Victoria was not done. Her eyes remained fixed on Naomi. This is absurd. She is not one of us. The words hung in the air like poison. Naomi slowly rose from her chair then, setting the folder gently on the desk, her face calm though her chest burned. You are right, she said softly. Both Richard and Victoria turned toward her. Naomi met Victoria's stare without blinking. I am not one of you. Victoria smirked faintly, thinking she had won. But Naomi stepped forward. Because I know what it feels like to lose everything and rebuild from nothing. I know what it means to choose responsibility over comfort. I know what sacrifice looks like when no one is clapping for you. Victoria's smile faded. Naomi's voice stayed steady, low, and measured. And if that makes me different from the people in this building, then perhaps that is exactly why I belong here. Richard stared at Naomi with something close to admiration. Victoria's face hardened, embarrassed that the woman she had tried to belittle had not only stood her ground but somehow made her feel small in the process. Words are easy, Victoria said coldly. Anyone can sound intelligent for 5 minutes. She turned sharply toward Richard. If you are seriously considering this, then test her. Let her prove herself. Richard frowned. Victoria, no, Victoria interrupted. If she is so qualified, let her earn it the same way everyone else in this company had to. Naomi narrowed her eyes slightly. Richard studied Victoria, then Naomi, clearly thinking. Finally he leaned back against the desk. Fine, he said. Victoria smiled in satisfaction. Richard turned toward Naomi. Tomorrow morning, our team presents the Henderson International acquisition proposal to the board. It is a $12 million expansion deal, and half the executives in this building have been preparing for it for weeks. Naomi listened carefully. Richard's gaze sharpened. I want you to lead the presentation. The room went still. Even Victoria blinked in surprise. Naomi's heart skipped. Richard stepped closer. You will have tonight to review the materials. Tomorrow morning at 9 you stand before the board and prove whether you belong in that chair. Victoria's lips curled into a smug smile, clearly convinced Naomi would fail under that kind of pressure. Perfect, she said sweetly. Let us see if the janitor can survive in heels. Naomi held Richard's gaze for a long moment, the weight of the challenge settling over her shoulders like armor. Then she lifted her chin. All right, she said calmly. Victoria's smile faltered slightly, surprised by the lack of fear. Naomi picked up the folder from the desk, her fingers tightening around it. Then I will see you both tomorrow morning. She turned and walked toward the door, heels clicking softly against the floor, her posture steady despite the storm building in her chest. But the second she stepped into a hallway, the confidence slipped just enough for her breath to catch. Because tomorrow was not just a test. It was the moment that would decide whether the world saw her as who she was, or only who she used to be. Naomi spent that night alone at her kitchen table beneath the soft yellow glow of a flickering overhead light, surrounded by stacks of printed reports, legal binders, and handwritten notes that covered every inch of the worn wood surface like pieces of a life she thought she had buried years ago. Outside her apartment window the city moved in restless waves of headlights and distant sirens, but inside there was only silence, broken by the slow turning of pages and the scratch of her pen against paper. She had changed into sweatpants hours ago, kicked off her heels, tied her hair back, and yet somehow the pressure in her chest still made her feel as if she were standing in that office under Victoria's judgment all over again. The Henderson International acquisition proposal was more complicated than she expected, not because the deal itself was difficult, but because the strategy Whitmore's team had built around it was weak. Sloppy projections. Inflated assumptions. A growth forecast based more on optimism than actual market conditions. Naomi frowned as she circled another flawed estimate in red ink. "How did no one catch this?" she whispered to herself. Her eyes scanned the numbers again. Then again. Then suddenly her expression changed. She sat up straighter. Her fingers flew through the pages, pulling financial statements from different quarters, comparing margins, debt structures, expansion forecasts. The deeper she dug, the colder she felt. This was not just weak. It was dangerous. If Whitmore Global moved forward with the acquisition under the current proposal, the company would overextend itself by nearly $20 million in under 18 months. Naomi leaned back slowly, stunned. "No," she whispered. "No, no, no." She checked the figures a third time. Same answer. The entire strategy was flawed. The entire presentation was built on a mistake no one had seen. Or worse, one no one wanted to admit. Her eyes drifted to the clock. 2:14 in the morning? Most people would have panicked. Most people would have gone to sleep and prayed for the best. But Naomi Carter had not survived life by panicking. She took a slow breath, rolled up her sleeves, and got to work rebuilding the entire proposal from scratch. By sunrise her eyes burned, her shoulders ached, and her coffee had gone cold twice, but spread across her table now was not the weak, polished disaster Whitmore's executives had prepared. It was a real strategy. Clean. Sharp. Ruthlessly practical. The next morning the boardroom buzzed with low conversation as executives filed into their seats, dressed in expensive suits and carrying tablets, coffees, and quiet skepticism. Victoria Langley stood near the far end of the room in cream silk, speaking to another vice president with a smile that practically radiated confidence. She looked up when Naomi entered. And for just a moment, Victoria's smile sharpened. Naomi wore a fitted navy suit Richard's assistant had rushed to have tailored overnight, her hair neatly pinned back, her heels steady against the marble floor, and though fear churned in her stomach, her face revealed none of it. Richard stood at the front of the room beside the presentation screen and nodded toward her once as she approached. "Ready?" he asked quietly. Naomi gave a small nod. "As I will ever be." Richard stepped aside. Naomi moved to the front of the room. Every eye followed her. She could feel the weight of their doubt pressing down from every direction. Victoria leaned back in her chair with folded arms and a smile that said she was waiting for the fall. Naomi placed her notes on the podium and inhaled once. Then she began. Her voice came out smooth. Calm. Stronger than she expected. She walked them through the market trends first, then the debt analysis, then the projected returns. The room slowly quieted. One by one. Executives stopped glancing at their phones. Stopped whispering. Started listening. Naomi moved through each slide with growing confidence, every word sharp and deliberate, years of forgotten instinct flooding back into place like muscle memory. Even Victoria's smile faded. Then halfway through the presentation, Naomi clicked to the final financial forecast slide and the room froze. "There is one more thing," she said. Richard frowned slightly. Naomi turned toward the screen. "The current Henderson proposal should not move forward." Gasps rippled across the room. Richard's eyes widened. Victoria shot upright in her seat. Naomi looked directly at the board. "Because if this company follows the original acquisition model prepared by the executive team..." She clicked the remote, and a new red projection chart filled the screen. "Whitmore Global will lose $20 million within 18 months. The room exploded into stunned whispers. Victoria's face turned white. Richard stared at the screen, speechless. And Naomi stood tall beneath the projector light, knowing the real test had only just begun. The room erupted into overlapping voices so fast Naomi could barely hear her own breathing. Board members leaned toward one another whispering in disbelief. Papers shuffled frantically across the polished table, and several executives immediately reached for their tablets to check the numbers on screen as if hoping they would somehow change if viewed from a different angle. Richard Whitmore stood frozen near the edge of the room, his eyes locked on the red chart behind Naomi. The color drained from his face as the reality of what she had just exposed settled over him. Victoria Langley rose so quickly her chair nearly tipped backward. "That is impossible," she snapped, her voice cutting through the noise. "Those projections were reviewed by our entire executive strategy division." Naomi turned calmly toward her. "Then your executive strategy division missed nearly $20 million in debt exposure." A murmur swept through the room. Victoria's face tightened. "You are manipulating numbers you barely understand." Naomi did not flinch. She clicked the remote again. And another slide appeared, this one packed with detailed figures, debt ratios, and market comparisons. "Page 42 of the Henderson Audit Report," she said evenly. "Projected maintenance liabilities were omitted from your valuation model." Page 58. "International shipping tariffs were calculated using last year's rates, not this quarter's." Page 63. "The expansion forecast assumes 12% annual growth in a market that has not exceeded 4.8% in 6 years." Each statement landed like a hammer blow. Executives rushed through their binders. Several faces visibly changed as they found the pages she referenced. One board member adjusted his glasses and muttered, "She is right." Another whispered, "Dear God." Victoria's confidence cracked. "That does not prove the acquisition is unsalvageable," she argued quickly, but even her voice had lost its edge now. Naomi stepped toward the table, her posture steady, her voice stronger than ever. "No. It proves the current strategy is reckless." She clicked again. A new slide appeared. "However, if Whitmore Global restructures the acquisition over 36 months instead of 18, negotiates staggered payment benchmarks, and delays the South American expansion until Q3. She paused, and a green profit projection replaced the red losses. "The company can increase projected profit by 32% over 5 years. Silence. Absolute silence. Even the air in the room seemed still. Every eye stared at the screen, then at Naomi, then back to the screen as the impossible truth settled over everyone at once. She had not only found the mistake. She had solved it. Richard slowly stepped forward, unable to look away from the figures. "Run that model again," he ordered one of the analysts. The young man's hands trembled as he typed. 10 seconds later he looked up, pale and stunned. "It is accurate," he whispered. "Every number checks out." A wave of disbelief swept through the boardroom. Richard turned slowly toward Naomi, his expression unreadable, almost like he was seeing her for the first time all over again. Victoria looked around the room desperately, but the room had already shifted. The doubt was gone now, replaced with awe. One board member stood and cleared his throat. "Mr. Whitmore," he said carefully, "with all due respect, if this woman had not stepped in, we would have approved a catastrophic deal yesterday and a disastrous acquisition today." Another nodded. "I believe we have seen enough." Victoria's face turned ghostly white as the oldest board member in the room leaned forward and folded his hands. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice calm but full of respect, "where exactly have you been hiding all these years?" Soft laughter rippled through the room, but this time it was not cruel. This time it carried admiration. Naomi allowed herself the faintest smile. Richard looked toward Victoria then, his expression hardening into something cold and final. "The Henderson strategy was your division's responsibility, was it not?" Victoria swallowed hard. "Richard, I can explain." "No," he interrupted sharply. "You can clear out your office." The room went still again. Victoria blinked in shock. "What?" Richard's voice dropped lower, sharper than ice. "If Naomi had not caught this, your negligence would have cost this company tens of millions. You questioned her because of her uniform while your own people nearly buried us." Victoria stood speechless, her mouth opening but no sound coming out. Richard stepped toward Naomi, eyes still fixed on Victoria. You spent so much time deciding who belonged in this room. Then he turned fully toward Naomi, pride unmistakable in his face. You forgot to recognize the smartest person in it. The boardroom remained silent long after Victoria gathered her trembling hands and walked out without another word, the heavy door closing behind her with a soft click that somehow sounded louder than any shout. No one moved. No one spoke. They all simply stared at Naomi Carter standing beneath the glow of the projector screen, calm and composed, while the weight of everything she had just done settled over the room like thunder after lightning. Richard Whitmore slowly stepped toward her, his polished shoes quiet against the marble floor, and for once there was no arrogance in his face, no pride, no cold superiority. Only humility. Real humility. He stopped in front of her, his voice low enough that the room had to lean in to hear it. I owe you more than an apology, he said. Naomi looked at him steadily, saying nothing. Richard swallowed once, then continued. Yesterday I saw a uniform and thought that told me everything about your worth. Today you exposed mistakes my highest paid executives failed to catch, saved this company twice, and reminded every person in this room what real competence actually looks like. He paused, the emotion in his voice raw now. And I am ashamed of the way I treated you. The room stayed perfectly still. Naomi studied him for a long moment, seeing no performance in his eyes, no polished executive speech, only a man confronting the ugliness of his own assumptions. Richard reached into his suit jacket and pulled out the contract she had been offered, then placed it gently on the table between them. Naomi Carter, he said firmly, loud enough for everyone to hear. I would like to formally offer you the position of Chief Strategy Officer of Whitmore Global, effective immediately. The room gasped. A few board members actually sat forward in disbelief. One whispered, Chief Strategy Officer? Naomi blinked, stunned for the first time all day. That title was higher than the position Richard had offered her before. Much higher. Richard met her eyes and gave the smallest shake of his head. Not because I pity you, he said. Not because I owe you. But because after what I witnessed today, offering you anything less would be insulting. Naomi stared at him, emotions flickering across her face so quickly she could barely process them herself. For years she had been unseen. Forgotten. Reduced to cleaning messes for people who never once wondered if she had dreams of her own. And now the most powerful man in the company stood before her asking her to help lead it. The oldest board member smiled warmly. Take the job, Miss Carter. Frankly, after today, I would sleep better knowing you are in charge. Soft laughter rolled through the room, warm this time, respectful. Naomi looked down at the contract, then back at Richard. You understand, she said softly. If I accept this, I will not be here to make people comfortable. Richard gave a quiet smile. Good. Comfortable people nearly cost me $20 million. Even Naomi laughed softly at that. Then her expression turned serious again. Before I accept anything, she said, I need one promise. Richard straightened immediately. Anything. Naomi's eyes swept the room. No one in this building is ever judged again because of how they look, where they came from, or what title they hold. Not while I work here. Richard nodded instantly. Done. Naomi looked around the room, at the executives who once ignored her, the board members who now watched her with admiration, the same walls she had once wiped down while invisible to everyone around her. Then slowly she picked up the pen. Her hand trembled only slightly as she signed the contract. The second the pen left the paper, the room erupted into applause. Loud, genuine, overwhelming applause. Naomi closed her eyes for just 1 second as emotion swelled in her chest, memories flashing through her mind. Hospital bills, sleepless nights, job rejections, empty apartments, grief, humiliation, sacrifice, years of being unseen. All of it had led here. Richard extended his hand. Naomi looked at it, then took it firmly. The applause continued around them, but Richard leaned in slightly and said quietly, only for her to hear, You did not just earn this room today. His eyes softened. You changed it. Naomi's throat tightened as she looked around once more, the sunlight pouring through the towering windows and casting gold across the polished floor, and for the first time in years, she did not feel like someone surviving life. She felt like someone stepping fully back into it. 3 months later, the sound of Naomi Carter's heels echoed through the executive hallway every morning at exactly 7:58, sharp and steady against the polished marble floors where a janitor cart once rolled behind her. Employees no longer looked past her when she entered a room. They stood straighter. They greeted her first. They listened when she spoke. The brass plaque outside the corner office gleamed. Beneath the overhead lights, polished so brightly it reflected the morning sun from the windows across the hall, Naomi Carter, Chief Strategy Officer. Sometimes Naomi still paused when she saw it, just for half a second, because part of her still remembered the woman who had once stood in that same hallway holding a mop while executives brushed past her like she did not exist. But that woman was gone now. Not erased. Not forgotten. Transformed. Inside the company, things had changed quickly under Naomi's leadership. Departments that once ignored support staff now treated every employee with visible respect. Hiring practices shifted. Internal reviews became stricter. Promotions were based on merit, not politics. For the first time in years, Whitmore Global was not just profitable. It was respected. And the people knew exactly who had reshaped it. Richard Whitmore kept his promise. He listened more than he spoke. He asked for Naomi's counsel before major decisions. And though he remained the powerful businessman he had always been, something in him had softened, sharpened, matured. He no longer mistook authority for wisdom. One Friday afternoon, as golden sunlight poured across the office windows and painted the skyline in orange and gold, Richard stood quietly in Naomi's doorway watching her review reports at her desk, glasses low on her nose, pen moving across the margins of a financial packet. "You still mark papers like your life depends on it," he said with a faint smile. Naomi looked up and smirked. "That is because your executives still keep making mistakes." Richard laughed softly and stepped inside. He placed a folder on her desk. "For you." Naomi frowned and opened it. Her breath caught. Inside was the finalized deed to a small townhouse just outside the city. Naomi looked up immediately. "Richard," he raised a hand gently. "It is not charity." Naomi narrowed her eyes. Richard smiled. "It is your performance bonus," the board insisted. Naomi stared down at the papers, emotion washing over her so suddenly she had to blink hard to keep her composure. "You bought me a house?" Richard shrugged lightly. "Technically the board did. I just made sure they understood how much you were worth." Naomi laughed softly through the emotion rising in her chest. Then her expression gentled. "Thank you?" Richard nodded once. Then his voice dropped quieter. "No, Naomi." He looked around her office, then back at her. "Thank you? You saved my company. But more than that." He paused, choosing the words carefully. "You made me a better man than I was the day I met you." Naomi's eyes softened. Richard gave her one final nod and quietly stepped back toward the door, leaving her alone in the golden light of the office she had earned with every sacrifice life had demanded from her. Later that evening, long after most employees had gone home, Naomi stood alone outside the building on the front steps of Whitmore Global, the cool evening breeze brushing gently against her face as city lights flickered alive one by one across the skyline. She looked up at the towering glass buildings stretching into the darkening sky, remembering every step of the journey that had brought her here. The grief. The struggle. The humiliation. The long nights wondering if her best years were behind her. And then she smiled softly to herself, because now she understood something life had spent years trying to teach her. Sometimes the world buries your worth beneath pain, loss, and rejection. But that does not mean your value is gone. It only means the right moment has not come yet. Behind her, the glass doors opened and Richard stepped outside, stopping beside her in silence. Either of them spoke for a moment. They simply stood together under the city lights, looking up at the building where everything had changed.